Welcome back. Against the background of the 400 years of history, one of the cultural issues that affected Judaism was Hellenism. Much of what we see in Jewry of Jesus' day is a result of the interaction between the Orthodox faith and the influence of Greek culture. Let's have a look. Most everyone knows of Alexander the Great as perhaps the greatest conqueror in antiquity. But he was far more than that. Having been tutored by the philosopher Aristotle, he was deeply imbued with the worldview of classical Greece. And so, when he invaded the Persian Empire, he brought along intellectuals, scientists, surveyors, engineers, and writers. His goal of a unified empire required the fusion of disparate peoples, and he needed such a retinue to accomplish that. One might say that he brought Greece with him on campaign. The cultural aspects left in his wake included cities, many named for himself, like Alexandria in Egypt, others like Antioch, and even one named for his horse. The Greek language went where he went, and so did the pursuit of learning, with the influence of Aristotle, Greek literature, and the Socratic method. Nations were introduced to Greek styles of dress, made for active life, and to the Greek pantheon of gods. The troops brought the games with them and intermarriage with the locals, which Alexander encouraged. Whether deliberately imposed or not, this culture went with them. Two quotations from David Carter illuminate the nature and the process of Hellenism. At the heart of Hellenism was the polis, the city-state. For a Greek, the polis was the source of identity. A man was a citizen of Athens or Corinth or Thebes. His life was public, lived out in the marketplace, the law courts, and the assembly. The highest good was to serve the city. Here's his second observation. This was the slow, seductive creep of an idea, Hellenism. It was more than just an appreciation for Greek art or language. It was a total system for living, a worldview that proposed a universal human culture based on reason, aesthetics, and the glorification of the human form and mind. We might be inclined to call this humanism with gods, and it invites some questions. With this worldview, why have gods? Modern humanism dispenses with them. And then, what are the Greek gods anyway, and what purpose did they serve? Those questions deserve more time than this lecture allows, unfortunately. Perhaps another time. But what in the end did Alexander's campaign produce? There's the obvious, the largest empire yet seen, and in only 11 years. But the cultural products? No caste system. Everyone was a polites, a citizen. Before long, all spoke Greek, but not the Greek of Plato. Two experts tell us about it. Koine Greek is classical Greek with the bugs taken out. That's Harvard's A.T. Robertson. Koine is a language optimized for communication, not literary artistry, says Robert Funk. More food for thought, if we consider how the apostles used it. And then there were the cities, genuine engines of influence, with all one could see there. The locals watched and liked what they saw. not, however, all of them. The contrast with Jewish culture was stark. Hellenism valued each city-state, while for a Jew there was only one that mattered. Koine meant the version of Greek common to all, while Hebrew was God's own language, with allowances for its dialect, Aramaic. A Greek found much to learn from literature and discussion, while for a Jew, truth came from the covenant and its prophets. As we had seen, Greeks favored light and casual dress, but God had enjoined modesty right in the Torah. You shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs. And no sharper contrast can be imagined than that between a pantheon of gods and Jewish monotheism. The Greeks loved their games, with athletes competing nude. Games were not a feature of Jewish culture, and individual competition was not a value for them. Hellenes ate anything they liked, while to a Jew, some animals were unclean. Alexander's people were encouraged to intermarry, but God's people were to be separate from all nations, and intermarriage was a gross sin. And two world views contrasted here. Man was the focus of the world for a Greek, but Yahweh was all in all to Israel. Given that contrast of cultures, Hellenism's influence on Judaism was complicated. From 323 to 198 BC, Egypt was the dominant force for it. Ptolemy I shocked Israel by exploiting their tradition. He entered Jerusalem on the Sabbath, knowing they would not resist, and carried off about 100,000 of them, some as slaves, but most to serve in his army. These would have been exposed to the museum, library, and zoo that he founded in Alexandria. Ptolemy II was downright benevolent toward them, reducing their taxes. Seeing that many of them had learned Greek and were forgetting Hebrew, he also sponsored a translation of the Torah for them. Ptolemy III was kindest of all. He actually sacrificed according to Jewish ritual at the temple, decreed that synagogues be protected, and even resolved a tax dispute by appointing a Jew to the post. Ptolemy IV treated them well early in his reign, but when they absolutely forbade him to enter the Holy of Holies, he turned hostile and initiated persecution of them. Over that century plus, however, in the main, the Ptolemies allowed the Jews their unique traditions and did not impose the Hellenistic lifestyle on them. Now, this period did see more and more Jews coming to Egypt, but the influx began much earlier. In 586 BC, after the first wave taken into Babylonian exile, many who remained in Israel were desperate to get out from under Nebuchadnezzar's control. They killed the governor whom the king had appointed, and fearful for their lives, and angry at Jeremiah for his warnings not to go to Egypt, they kidnapped him. 1 Kings 25 then says, "Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces, arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans." Some 60 years later, we actually saw some Jewish mercenary soldiers in Egypt build a temple there, far up the Nile at Elephantine, beyond Aswan. How could they justify such a project? Of course, they were very far from home, making a trip to Jerusalem next to impossible. But they also found a passage in Isaiah that suggested their act would be legitimate. In that day there shall be an altar to Yahweh in the land of Egypt. The site has been excavated, by the way, making a reconstruction drawing possible. Then, as I stated earlier, in 312 BC, Ptolemy I deported some 100,000 Jews from Israel for his purposes. But the years following saw a large number emigrating to Egypt by choice. One can see why. In just a few decades, Israel was the scene of 5 territorial battles between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and many Jews judged that Egypt would be safer than their home country. By the mid-3rd century BC, there were an estimated 300,000 Jews in Egypt, many of them in Alexandria. That city was the locale for translating the Septuagint. Of its 5 boroughs, 2 were predominantly Jewish, and most had acquired Greek. Alexandria itself, perhaps the most successful of Alexander's founded cities, had flourished. An ideal center for trade with the Mediterranean world, it hosted a varied and well-educated population. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, definitely favored the Jews. Aware that those under his rule, as well as those scattered across the Greek Empire, might welcome having their scriptures in Greek, he sponsored a translation of them. It required a major effort. Jewish tradition says that Ptolemy gathered 72 scholars in Alexandria, assigned each to a different cubicle in the famous lighthouse, and put them to work. After 72 days, they gathered and compared their results, finding that they all had produced identical texts. It was clearly inspired. Apart from that legend, we do know that the Pentateuch was completed first, with the remaining books done over the next century. The work is called the Septuagint, from the Greek term for 70, rounded down a bit, you see. In a decision that had made implications for history, the translators included the Apocrypha. The Septuagint was regarded differently by audiences over the next few centuries. First, the need for such a translation was counterbalanced by a reluctance to endorse it. You may perceive why there was hesitation. After all, God had revealed his word in Hebrew, and some believed it should remain as he gave it. That view was most strongly held in Israel, though. Other Jews, surrounded in the diaspora by Greek speakers, were more inclined to see its value. Jesus, the apostles, and the early church used it preferentially, but the rabbis and their disciples were vehemently opposed. A noted rabbi offered this condemnation: "The accursed day on which the 70 elders wrote the law in Greek for the king was like the day of the golden calf." We need not be surprised at such hostility when we note developments in the 1st century. The rabbis were frustrated by the Christians' success in gaining conversions with the use of the translation, and called it a Christian text. For example, they cited Isaiah 7:14. The Septuagint reads, A virgin, Parthenos, shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. But in the Hebrew, the word is Alma, which doesn't necessarily mean virgin, but a maiden ready for marriage. So, claiming the Septuagint was corrupt, they produced other translations. Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion were among those, and Origen's Hexapla, a massive work with 6 translations displayed side by side, gave them an excuse to claim flaws in the Septuagint. The Christians, however, were happy to have a Greek Old Testament to combine with the Apostles' Greek writings. And as we shall see later, Jerome's Latin Vulgate depended heavily on the Septuagint. But to return to Hellenism's impact on Judaism, after more than a century under Egyptian rule, the balance shifted and the Seleucids dominated Israel. Early on, Antiochus III treated the Jews well. Hoping to win their support against Egypt, he remitted their taxes, guaranteed their right to be governed by the Torah, and encouraged their migrating to other parts of his empire. But then, when he lost a battle with Rome and was placed under a huge indemnity, his need for money moved him to extort it from the Jews. That same indemnity pushed his successor to try looting the temple's treasures, and only massive resistance deterred him. All grew worse under Antiochus IV, who believed that enforced Hellenism would hold his far-flung empire together, and the Jews were the most resistant to that. The Roman historian Tacitus has a memorable observation here. When the Macedonians became supreme, King Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, strove to destroy the national superstition and to introduce Greek civilization, but was prevented by his war with the Parthians from at all improving this vilest of nations. There will be more to come about this Seleucid king. Overall, though, we might say that the Seleucids were initially inclined to favor the Jews, but their need for money and obsession with Hellenism brought persecution. It's important to know that almost 2 centuries of exposure to Hellenism actually split the Jews into 2 camps, and later, as we will see, into more. But at this point, around 170 BC, Jews could be seen as traditionalists and Hellenizers. Some comments from historians will be helpful here. Paul Botha. Greek culture was attractive, especially to the young. It offered sophistication, opportunity, and social advancement. Many Jews began adopting Greek names, Greek dress, and Greek customs. So you could identify a young Hellenizer just by observing him. Here's David Carter. The Hellenizers, the urban, the wealthy, and the politically connected, they believed that for Judea to survive and prosper, it had to modernize and integrate into the surrounding cosmopolitan Greek-speaking world. They were not necessarily attempting to abandon their God, but rather to reinterpret their faith in a way that was compatible with the dominant culture. Were the Hellenizers even abandoning Shabbat, the Sabbath observance? Not, however, as far as we know, but participating nude in the games drove many to attempt to reverse their circumcision, a grueling process that was only partly successful. But now Here is Carter's view of the traditionalists. Opposing them was a broad and fervent movement of traditionalists known as the Hasidim, meaning the pious. They were not yet an organized party, but a groundswell of resistance from the countryside, the villages of Judea, and the circles of scribes and lower-ranking priests, who were horrified by the events in the capital. Their commitment was to the meticulous observance of the Torah, the preservation of the covenant, and the separation of the Jewish people from the corrupting influence of the Gentiles. They recalled God's instruction from all the way back to the conquest of Canaan. Be separate, and you will remain true to the Creator and the covenant. But we should leave the last statements to the Hasidim themselves, who saw it happening. Here is the corruption of some of their own priests. They no longer cared for the services of the altar. Despising the temple and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful exercises in the wrestling arena, at the call of the discus. And here is their judgment on Hellenism. In those days, certain renegade Jews came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. For since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us." This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision, and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. Hellenism was forcing Judaism to an existential crisis. One man would drive it into open war. That was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He will be the focus of our next session. Please join us then. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the series, you may address them to me, drjerryc4@yahoo.com.